as I was growing up, music was a very important part of our lives. Uh, it wasn't a bookish culture I came from, but there was a great deal of music, records, radio, eventually music everywhere in the streets, through people's windows in the summertime. And as I started to put together the impulse to tell a story, I found that very often the music was something that created that moment of visualization, so to speak. And often the music that was being heard or being played in the street or in the car radio counterpointed to the scenes I was seeing around me, created the films. And eventually this all led to my use of music in Who's That Knocking, or particularly Mean Streets, and eventually even Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and eventually Raging Bull, into Goodfellas, etc. But in an odd way, pulling on those scenes together, hearing that everybody talking about movies at the time in 1950s, and my father, my uncles talking about certain films, and then mentioning other stories that are going on in the family or in the street, and somebody would say something like, "Oh, they could never make a movie of that," and that's what I wanted to do. So why not? You know. So all this was coming together, and music was so prominent, and almost like what you would call the sense memory, in a sense. So it really begins with the music for me. And once I hear the music, I mean, I really start to feel the story, you know. Sometimes a piece of music reflects a character for me, and I start to imagine scenes. It isn't that I sit down and start to imagine, they sort of come to you while you're listening to the music. When I finally started making feature films, I knew that my movies would not have a proper score. They weren't meant to have that. In a way, they weren't deserving of that, because those films, or the pictures that were made up to that time around the world, or, you know, they were something that were unattainable. They were the guides. They were the something we aspired to. Couldn't really do something like them, you know, even though you try, you know. So the kind of films I was making just didn't lend themselves to this kind of thinking, a kind of, at times, not more negative sometimes in terms of Hollywood scores or traditional scores. Sometimes they were coded, and the narratives were very different. There are different ways of indicating emotions and characters in music, in that tradition. And I was not from that tradition, I felt. The only thing that restricted us to a certain extent was that at that time, we did not have the budgets to pay for licenses. And so we did want the films to be shown in theaters if possible. And so that became a bit of a problem in terms of how much we could use, where we could get it, who would allow us to use it, et cetera. Well, for example, the use of Ray Baretta's El Watusi in Who's That Knocking at My Door was a pivotal moment for me in trying to shape a film together. Or, you know, in Mean Streets was where it all finally came together, where somehow the producers, Jonathan Taplin, all of them, somehow found a way to, in a very, very low budget, able to pay for some licensing of music, including the Rolling Stones' Jumpin' Jack Flash. The scene was designed around that song, and Rubber Biscuit designed Be My Baby by the Ronettes. All the scenes in the film were designed around those particular pieces of music. And we were able to get, for the most part, some of the licensing done. And so, for me, that's how movies were made. I never thought of making a score for a film or having a score created for a film at that time. The music that I was using was part of the world in which the characters live. They echo. I would hear them echoing through the hallways and the streets and the windows and car radios. And it was like a physical as well as mental architecture of the world I was trying to create. And in a way, the music I chose, very carefully chose, and music that inspired me for certain scenes and certain films, they're part of the spiritual life of the characters. This was not common practice in Hollywood filmmaking. It really started later. But there were certain pictures in which it was a very important factor. For instance, there was use of popular music in the early 30s, but not the actual recordings the way they use now. The entire score, there is no score for this particular film, only popular music, and that was The Public Enemy, the James Cagney, William Wellman film, classic, which used the popular tune I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles as a key element, though it's not the original recordings. But all the music in that film comes from the source, or whether it's a band at a nightclub or a record on a machine. There's no scoring the way we know of it today. And then in the early 60s, it was the great Kenneth Anger film, Scorpio Rising, which was, of course, a revelation to me and many others. Of course, that was not a feature film. It's what's termed as an avant-garde film, and wasn't made for the general public. So when I started to make my own films, the score for that film freed me in a way. And I realized that I would be able to use the music I was growing up with, the music that was around me all the time, whether it was standards, rock and roll, opera, classical, swing, jazz, anything. When I was growing up, I remember loving the music from the Hollywood films. I immediately could tell you if Dmitri Tiomkin did something. I loved Miklos Hortz's music. David Raksin, his scores were extraordinary, especially for Force of Evil. The 50s Elmer Bernstein scores were remarkable, also for the breadth of his work. Whether, his first two scores were Man with the Golden Arm and The Ten Commandments. I think it was in the same year. Memorable, and as I used to say, is sort of his music inhabits the film in a way. I do love traditional scores, and I did end up working with many myself in my own films, but the traditional scores tended to have a uniformity to them. As I said, they were locked into certain thematic codes. Nowadays, of course, a different kind of uniformity, pop songs or lyrics, and sometimes they actually just literally echo the emotions of the characters or whatever, and they comment right on the action, or ironic comment on the action, which is something else entirely. But by the time I finished King of Comedy, again, there was no traditional score in King of Comedy, and what I found was, through a series of circumstances, I found myself starting all over again in a way, to make movies, and I wound up making an independent film in New York called After Hours, and I found there that needed a score. And I felt at that point in time I could experiment with actually working with the new composers, Howard Shore, and I thought it was a beautiful score. So Howard was the one that really began a series of films for me, Howard, and I was able then to work with Elmer Bernstein. So they were the ones actually who created the score, which one relates to a straight narrative film. They were the ones who created it first for me. When we finally did work with scores, a score like the one that Howard Shore did for The Departed, which was an electric guitar, a tango rhythm. They work in counterpoint with the popular songs on the soundtrack. And the tango itself, of course, is a sense of danger. It becomes a kind of dance of death between these two characters, played by Leo and Matt, leading parallel false lives and slowly converging. A different kind of example, again here, this was scoring, not using a score, the score for Shutter Island, which is made up of pieces of modernist composers. In that film, I wanted a sense of otherness, of constant intrusions, which sort of echoed the inner experience of this character played by Leo DiCaprio, and something that couldn't have happened with a composer, I felt. Somebody once pointed out, it's almost as if you hear the music seeping through the walls, like coming out of a waking dream. That was the idea. I didn't want one voice, but many different ones, and you never knew which voice was going to come at you. We kept going back to the music of Ligeti, which most filmmakers know from Kubrick. And this kind of score also starts with him. This is the opposite of the score for Taxi Driver, where I was lucky enough to work with Bernard Herrmann. There, the music is a singular voice, growing from deep within the tension between Travis and the world around him, the city of New York in the 1970s. When I told people that I wanted to ask Herrmann to compose the score for Taxi Driver, and by the way, it turned out to be, sadly, his very last score, they weren't quite sure what I was getting at. But I knew that I wanted something that would be kind of at odds with the rhythm of the city and the way it was being depicted. It was Travis's rhythm, you see. That's the thing. I didn't want to use popular music because he didn't listen to music. So it had to come from inside of him, something that was obsessive, that was coiled and sort of ready to strike and explode, you know? It's all happening inside. He doesn't let the outside world in, doesn't let the music in. There is one piece of popular music, Jackson Browne, Too Late for the Sky, but he's watching television with that. It's coming off the TV. The rest of it is the score, of course, by Bernard Herrmann. By the time we did Last Temptation of Christ, the score again was somewhat experimental with Peter Gabriel. After that was Goodfellas, which again was the popular music, or music of the source music, so to speak. I was very disappointed when I learned, starting to make my first films, that playing back music on the set and having the actors talk over it ruins the soundtrack of the actors. But it kept the energy going. And I figured, well, you could loop some of it. I didn't want to do that because I wanted the energy of the actors plus the music. And so over the years, we've been finding ways to try to play with that. Sometimes, and I've done it often, in the case, for example, of Goodfellas, when the last section of Layla is heard, I would play that back on the set to design, I would play that back on the set for the pace of the camera tracking and the sense of the whole the quality, the spirit of the film at that point. And this helped with the crew, it helped with the actors, and made it something very special. I would do things sometimes and use music that would not be used in the film, but I liked the feeling of it for camera moves, like the lantern from Satanic Majesty's Request by the Stones, playing that back on set sometimes. So primarily, though, if I do play it back on set, it's in the film. And it creates a great atmosphere on the set.